How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? What's the real truth about Citizen Kane?
It'll probably turn out to be a very simple thing.
Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. I'm Parker.
I'm Max.
And welcome back to another episode of Better Than Citizen Kane, the highly subjective show where we look at a movie and ask that titular question. Because when every movie ever made is a reasonable contender for the title of greatest film of all time, you have to wonder, better than Citizen Kane?
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ep, which I didn't like. Saying it out loud, I didn't like it. This week on the show, we're discussing Joseph L. Mankiewicz's All About Eve from 1950, oft considered one of the greatest films of all time. Can I pull off saying oft, do you think, Parker?
I think so. I think yeah.
Okay, good. Parker, also, can I tell you why I brought All About Eve to the show?
Please.
Okay, well, one, we'll be comparing and contrasting it to Citizen Kane, 1941, also oft considered one of the greatest films of all time. You're right, I can pull it off. Mm-hmm. And it was also actually written in part by a Mankiewicz, Joseph's brother Herman J. I just think that's interesting. Think that's interesting.
Gary
it's
Oldman
the Mank
himself.
brothers. Garrett, the star of Mank 2020. Mm-hmm. It's said that this film has one of the greatest screenplays of all time. It's number 28 on the AFI 100. Whether that's 1998 or 2007, I actually didn't check. I should have checked. Sorry, Parker. Anyway, we're friends. It's also number 211 on the BFI Sight and Sound as of 2022. Parker, I thought you'd especially find this interesting. It's tied with Brief Encounter and Suspiria, 1977.
Okay.
I thought you'd find that interesting. And it's also in the Library of Congress's National Film Registry.
Nice.
Number 3, I really enjoy this film. It's an iconic performance by Bette Davis. I have a lot of research on how all of this went down, and it seemed like it would be right up your alley. So what the hell, Parker? Why the 4 stars? And more importantly, what's your history with All About Eve? How long was it on your watch list? What can there be that I don't know?
Okay, first and foremost, I find it so entertaining that you consider 4 stars not up my alley.
Yeah, Parker hated it.
Yeah, I hated this movie,
Gave it
clearly.
4 stars. He hated
A man who gave it half a star more than I did. Insane.
Parker, you know it's the running gag that I have to act like you hate every movie I show you.
I do. I'm aware. I'm very much aware. It's a
big
good
part
bit.
of me processing my negative emotions.
Right.
No, it's actually just a bit.
Right.
But yeah, okay. So you gave it 4 stars.
I did. Yes.
We don't have to get into that right now. I'm sure much of that might come from the summary.
Sure.
But yeah, what is your history with this film, Parker?
I don't really have much of one. Like I've been aware of it. It's a movie that I knew existed.
Yes.
I'm going to be honest with you. It was probably, I don't know, maybe I was like 16 or 17. There was a stretch of time there where I fully thought in my head that Bette Davis and Betty White were the same person. And I was like, wow, that's a very interesting early career that Betty White had. Like, that's really cool. Just had not, there was a while. And then when I was about 17, it clicked. But yeah, there was a period of time.
Wow.
I'd known about it, have obviously seen the, fasten your seatbelts clip and montages and all these things.
Yeah.
Knew it was from this movie.
So that's where this line comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Because you hear that in places. You hear people reference that.
Yeah.
It's not as famous a reference as some other lines,
Right.
I think this is the great start of a beautiful friendship,
Yeah.
But it's out there, and I actually didn't realize until this watch when she said it again, and I was like, oh yeah, this isn't referencing. So this is probably the original text.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's pretty much it. I didn't know what it was about. I didn't know.
It's all about Eve, Parker. It's in the title.
See, and as I texted you, that's a goddamn lie, actually.
Parker went into this. You're suing for false advertising.
That's exactly right.
Because you went into this expecting it to be.
I
all
thought this
about
was
Eve.
a one-woman show.
Yeah,
is what I understood.
and it's not.
No, it's not.
Is this
peeved
an
about
Akira?
it.
Is this like an Akira situation where you were shocked that Bette Davis wasn't playing Eve?
Very much so. I totally thought Bette Davis was Eve.
Yeah.
From the go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my history with it.
Do you think there's a chance we could? No. Do you think there's a chance that Bette Davis ever did the Akira slide?
You know what? I wouldn't rule it out.
I wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah.
She would.
Yeah.
Anyway,
She would.
she
What's
would.
your history with this film?
My history of this film is that I didn't know a single goddamn thing about it until my goal this episode is to make it funny.
And you do that by impersonating David Lynch.
Look, I've been watching a lot of Lynch lately.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
That's the real
He's
reason
not
we're in
in
black
them.
and white,
I don't.
isn't it?
There's, yeah.
I thought so.
No, we're in black and white today in honor of Eve.
Salute.
Actually, we'll talk about Eve as a character. We'll talk about Eve Harrington. And
Eve
whether
Harrington.
or not we. But my history of this film is that I don't know how I heard about it. I think. Parker, it's that 2021 period of my life when I started watching movies for
You're
real.
like, oh, movies.
I was like, wait, you can just watch any movie. You can just go to the library and watch any movie. You can open HBO Max and watch any movie.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to use the working title of the Max streaming service. But it was 2021 at the time, so that's accurate. But yeah, I don't know how I landed on I'm going to watch All About Eve. It might have been an AFI 100 thing. It might have been like it's on the Letterboxd 250, which I actually didn't take note of where it is on the Letterboxd top 250. I think it's like roughly. I think it's in the 80s. I think it's 82.
That sounds about right.
Which sounds about right to me.
See.
But while you pull that up, I'll talk about my history, which
Please
is
do.
I watched it in 2021. And I remembered liking it, but being kind of bored.
Okay.
And then when I rewatched it I think I gave it 4 stars the first time I watched it. And then this time I watched it and I gave it my full attention and I was fully there. And I was just vibing with this movie. I think this is a really great screenplay. We'll kind of talk about Joseph L. Mankiewicz's strengths as a director. But as a writer, I think this is what I want every old movie to sound like. I just want, zingers and great dialogue and really interesting kind of moments of depth for characters as well. This is what it feels like dramas of the 40s and 50s. It's their peak. I feel like this is this kind of movie operating at its highest level.
Totally.
And I really enjoy it for that.
Nice.
But that's kind of my history. Like I said, I brought it to the show because I think it's a great movie, and it's oft considered to be a great movie.
Yeah.
And also, you've shown me a lot of movies I hadn't seen before, and I thought, hey, let's make Parker watch a movie.
I'm glad you did. I'm glad I watched this. And I looked it up. It's number 93 on
93. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fine. What's right above it? What's right below it? If you don't mind, if it's not too late, if you can pull
No.
up.
I can get there. Give me time.
He's getting there. I'm giving him time. He's gonna get there.
Right above it is Chaplin's City Lights, which we have covered.
Yeah, we have covered that.
And
Okay.
right below it is Kurosawa's Redbeard.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
that is
all
what's
right.
sitting on either side.
Okay, City Lights. That feels
Yeah.
I think I like this.
3
more than
above it
City
is
Lights, but
Inglourious Bastards, which feels kind of wrong to me.
That does. Yeah, I'll say it.
Yeah.
That is. I mean, it's
Yeah.
the only Tarantino I've seen. But I would say that this is probably.
I think it's probably better than Inglourious Bastards.
Should we change the podcast to better than Inglourious Bastards?
I think we should actually. Yeah, it might
Okay,
be more
great.
culturally relevant.
Yeah. Nah, let's keep with this.
All right.
One other item of business before we dive into research here, Parker,
Mm-hmm.
is I finished that book I was reading about Citizen Kane.
I saw, yes.
I've got a lot. Parker, unfortunately, I have a lot of respect for Citizen Kane.
Yeah, it's fine. It's whatever.
I worry that on a rewatch I don't know. Maybe it'll go to 4.5. Who knows? But also, it'll
Who
probably
knows?
stay at 4. And also, star ratings don't really matter. And let's just keep that in mind, everybody.
Well,
as I
unless
grill
they're mine,
Parker, as I
apparently.
grill Parker about his 4 stars, they don't matter unless it's Parker, because Parker shows me so many 5-star movies, so many movies that I love.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I haven't given him one in a while, so I just wanted to do something nice for you, and you made it 4 stars.
Hey, this is a capital G great for me. All right, it's 4
No,
stars.
I understand. And I'm excited to hear. I'm genuinely excited to hear about it. And
Yes.
I am thinking about how somebody, I think it was one of our recent guests, somebody pointed out, they were like, yeah, I mean, it's great to just sit here and listen to you and Parker argue. And my reaction was, I don't think we do that on this podcast. And now every time I argue with you on this podcast or give you crap, I go, yeah, I think people's takeaway might be that I hate Parker.
Yeah, I think people think that you're the antagonistic force,
which
in
is
this
not
dynamic.
true.
No. Max is a teddy bear. Max is a sweetheart. But you put a mic in front of him, and you put my star ratings, and suddenly he hulks out. It's it's crazy.
You're asking me. You're giving me an open mic, and you're showing me something I disagree with.
I might have mentioned this on the podcast before, but my all-time favorite moment of this, before we were ever doing the podcast, was that when I saw John Wick 4, I gave it 4 stars, and I said something along the lines of, like, I think this might have knocked Fury Road off its pedestal
as the greatest action movie of all time.
And you didn't tell me this at the time. This was like a couple weeks later at a party. You're like, yeah, I saw that, and I said, what the hell?
Yeah, it's like the only time that internet rage has taken over me. You know how people get really irrationally mad on the internet, and you're like, dude, what? It's literally just words on a screen. And it's like a film opinion. Like I got like Ghostbusters 2016 mad. Like I was like, oh, fuck you. And then I had this moment of reflection where I went, I haven't seen John Wick 4. And you know what? I did the thing that no one else on the internet is brave enough to do, which is to have a moment of self-reflection.
Yeah, and that's why we love you.
Before I confront Parker. And then I just told him later as a joke at a party, like a few weeks later.
That's so funny. That's my favorite version of this.
It is. It's really funny. It scares me. It's like when it's like an intrusive thought. I go, I didn't know I had that in me.
Yeah, you've got.
I didn't know I could be
the
internet
rage.
mad. I've got the internet rage in me. I've got the power of the dog in me. You know.
He got that dog in him.
Yeah. See, I was like, what's the film version of he's got that dog in him?
He got the power.
I guess
of the dog
he's
in
got that power of the dog in him.
Mm-hmm.
One day we'll cover Jane Camp. One day we'll cover Jane Campion.
Yeah.
Okay. All About Eve. Let's talk all about Eve. And by that I mean let's talk about Joseph L. Mankiewicz. Mm-hmm. He is and was a writer director. He's dead. But considered himself a writer first. Okay. He won across his career. He won 2 Oscars for writing and 2 for directing. He came out to Hollywood at the start of Talking Pictures. He started by writing title cards for silent movies, then moved to writing scripts, which is just such an interesting period.
Yeah.
Of like evolving as a career in Hollywood. He became
title cards. That's so interesting.
Right, and then he became a screenwriter. He wrote, and then he became a producer, and then he ended up as a director, which is just very interesting. Yeah. This is considered Mankiewicz's greatest script. Just kind of widely said so. I don't have a source for that. It just is. And he was really interested in class conflict, especially in his writing. He grew up on the Lower East Side, not well-to-do, and loved writing lower-class characters. He was also thus very interested in the concept of ambition. And another thing that interested him was he was fascinated by women who made their careers as actresses, what they have to do to address the power imbalance in society. He finds interest in studying the maneuvers they have to do, which of course leads to All About Eve being a film about women controlling how they are seen. Eve, Margo, and Karen all know they can script the scenes and decisions. He also came from a theatrical background and wanted to make movies in the same way as plays are constructed, which I just thought was kind of interesting. Like, he wanted there to be kind of that character depth that plays often have because they're so focused more on, like, the writing than they are on, like, visual components, which does lead to a lot of people fault Mankiewicz on being a cinematic director. They say that he never mastered the camera very well, that he didn't really have a visual style. One of his sons, which was on the behind-the-scenes featurette I watched on this DVD, which was not the Criterion release. My library only had like a 2000s edition, but it had like a full second disc of special features, which is something that I do miss.
We
like
used to be a proper country.
Everyone give Parker a moment. And his son said maybe he wasn't as brilliant as other directors, but he can hold his own with the literate aspects of cinema, and people don't give enough credit to that. Parker, what's your kind of thoughts on that, having seen this?
I can definitely see that. Like, especially, like, the structure of the whole thing feels very play-like. And, like, his direction of it is such that, like, there's interesting camera stuff going on, for sure, but a lot of his stuff, while still being stylistic of the time, feels very intentionally, like, staged. You know what I mean? Like, it plays on a flat plane as if the edges of the screen are proscenium arc.
Totally. Yeah, for sure. I agree. I think the thing that really works for me about that here is that this is a movie about theater. And so it doesn't stand out to me as much, because sometimes you watch a movie that feels like a play and you're like, oh, all right, like let's do something more visually interesting. But with this, the subject matter, what it is, it doesn't really need to be flashy.
Totally.
All of the flash comes from the dialogue and also the performances. I mean, obviously, like Bette Davis is like iconic in this role. She's just crushing it. She's kind of unreal.
She's
like
really
there's
good.
this moment when she's arguing with Lloyd in the theater when she has found out that, Eve read for her, and they're having this big blowout argument, and Lloyd's like leaving the theater. I do really like this whole scene and how it's blocked. And like him leaving the theater and just yelling back to her. And I love when he says, like, when will the piano realize it hasn't written a concerto? And she does like this stomp forward and then delivers her line and is like clutching her coat to her stomach with her arm. And just like everything about that moment, I'm just like, that's so, like, I don't know, something
really
about
good.
that really stood out to me.
That scene also has one of my favorite lines, which is like, I'm gonna butcher the phrase, and you probably know it better than I do.
I have the script pulled up as well.
It's something along the line. They're having the argument, and he says something along the lines of like, directors' woes will never end because actresses are always around, or he has some quip about it, which is very funny.
Yeah, it's Margo says, all playwrights should be dead for 300 years. And then Lloyd says that would solve none of their problems because actresses never die.
That's the line. It's so funny. It's so good.
Really good. It's just fantastic. There's just so many good. I also love there's a line from Bill when he's talking to Eve about theater, and he says, do you want to know what theater is? A flea circus. Also opera. Also rodeos. He says rodeos, which I was like, that's great.
Yeah.
Carnivals, ballets, Indian tribal dances, Punch and Judy, a one-man band, all theater. Wherever there's magic and make-believe in an audience, there's theater. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, really, but like at the end he says, it may not be your theater, but it's a theater of somebody somewhere. And I just love that in the middle of this, Joseph Mankiewicz was just like, I don't know, here's my take on theater.
Yeah, here's my treatise.
And there's also a lot of that. His sons are talking about how a lot of Addison DeWitt's kind of venom towards theater and that culture that's directly Joseph L. Mankiewicz speaking through Addison DeWitt.
Interesting.
Which I just thought was really interesting.
Which, shout out to freaking George Sanders, Shere Khan himself. Man,
yeah,
what a voice.
He's got a great voice, and he's really good in this too.
Really
like everyone's, that's what I was going to say is like, obviously Bette Davis is great, but I think that like, Gary Merrill's really good in this. Like, I think that, I just think everyone kind of
my favorite, like, she's not at all featured and is, like everybody else is here, but man, anytime I see Thelma Ritter show up, I'm just
Thelma
like,
Ritter
Thelma!
as Birdie is so good. She has some killer
Thelma
lines
Ritter.
too. Thelma Ritter is fantastic.
So
I watched this with my parents, and my dad was like, "Oh, she's always good."
She's
I was
always
like,
good.
Thelma
She
Ritter is always good.
Always delivers.
She always delivers. It's great. I feel like everyone here mostly like understood the assignment. Even a young Marilyn Monroe is in this movie.
I know. I was
Were
very
you
surprised.
very surprised?
Yeah, I was like,
I think she's great in this too.
She is
like
good.
she does that very like kind of like wide-eyed young, like she plays a character who's like young Hollywood actress coming into things trying to like woo producers, and it's like it's just fun that she's in there for a scene.
Totally.
She has a great line about, I can't remember what it is. It's right before she says she wants a drink. Anyway, obviously I could just make this episode, let's just read the screenplay.
Yeah, we could just do
Let's just talk about every good line, but we're not going to do that. So I want to talk about the true story that inspired this, Parker.
Okay.
Do you know anything about this?
Not a bit.
Okay, well, you wouldn't because it doesn't get a screen credit. But don't worry, we'll get into that. So there was a famous German actress named Elizabeth Bergner who was appearing on Broadway in 1944. And she had befriended Mary Orr, who was an American actress and writer. And at one point they went on a little like trip together, and Elizabeth Bergner started telling this story of this young woman who would see every single one of her shows and wait outside of the theater afterward to try and get a glimpse of her. It's literally basically this movie. And the young girl's name was Martina Lawrence, and she kind of wormed her way into the confidence of Bergner and her husband. Eventually, she ended up having a performance for a small group. It's not like what happens in the movie that gets kind of, she's pretty good.
Yeah.
And basically, Elizabeth Bergner told Mary Orr, she was like, yeah, I just realized I had to get rid of her because she was trying to take over my life. Which it just sounds like and Martina Lawrence has said, she's like, no, I wasn't trying to replace you. I was just trying to help you. Martina Lawrence is a very interesting person, and let's talk about that right now. So Mary Orr writes up this story. It goes to Cosmopolitan magazine, and it's called The Wisdom of Eve. Joseph L. Mankiewicz reads this, and he uses that as a springboard to jump into the theater world when writing all about Eve. Mary Orr was 23 at the time. She didn't receive a screen credit, but 20th Century Fox did give her $5,000 for the use of the idea, which at the time is not nothing.
Yeah.
Especially for like a 23-year-old woman at the time. I feel like that's
Totally.
pretty good, but still, like, no screen credit. But basically off of that, Martina Lawrence sees herself in Mary Orr's story and is upset by the fact that she's the villain. I mean, Eve is the villain, but Martina Lawrence is like, that's clearly me.
Yeah.
She once approached Mary Orr with a butter knife at a restaurant and demanded money. Which is, I'm like, there should have been a sequel to this. Like, no, I'm just kidding. But once the movie was out, there was just this side thing that I thought was interesting really quick. It's not about Martina Lawrence. Tallulah Bankhead felt that Davis was imitating her in the movie. And that's kind of widely considered of like, yeah, she was. Which is also interesting because every time they would bring a Broadway play that Tallulah Bankhead had starred in and they adapted it for film, the role that Tallulah Bankhead played always went to Bette Davis. She was just like Hollywood's Tallulah Bankhead.
Interesting.
So Tallulah Bankhead was just like, okay, whatever. Like
Sure.
you're Hollywood me, whatever. I think they met once and she was like, oh, you're the one who plays me in the pictures, which is just really great. Martina Lawrence moved to Venice, and then at one point Joseph L. Mankiewicz was staying in Venice in 1990. So this is way later. And she called him and said that she was the original Eve. And he was like, what? I don't even know if that's true. And then she sent him Elizabeth Bergner's autobiography to prove it. And then this story kind of wraps up here where Martina Lawrence requested that Hollywood theater producer Harry Hahn get her and Mary Orr together to meet.
Mm-hmm.
And Mary Orr was like, I don't want to do that. She's like, I'm like 90. You know, like they're both, this is in the 90s. They're both very old at this point. And he recorded the meeting. And this behind the scenes featurette played clips from it. And Mary Orr is like, why did you want to meet me? What's this obsession? It's been decades. And Martina's just like super weird about it. It's like, well, you made quite a career of it, mixing truth and fiction. And she's like, no, I did. I got paid $5,000. And she's like, and then you wrote a pretty shitty thing after that. And she's like, people liked that. And she's like, well, I thought it was really slutty and terrible. Or smutty or something. And like, it's just this weird conversation that I just randomly heard. I just thought that was kind of interesting.
That is interesting.
That it was based on a true story and one woman kind of hated that it was successful. Yeah, so kind of production on this. At this point, before this, Mankiewicz was kind of Hollywood's golden boy. He was just doing very interesting things. A lot of actresses liked him because he was writing female characters in a way that was a little more deep than other movies would give them, which I think is absolutely true of this, of like kind of the three female leads all get very complex stories and like emotions to portray here. So off of The Wisdom of Eve, Mankiewicz wrote a treatment for a film called Best Performance, sent it to Daryl Zanuck, who was the studio chief at 20th Century Fox at the time. And Zanuck's the one who circled the line all about Eve, in fact, and suggested the title change. Mankiewicz insisted upon Anne Baxter for the role of Eve Harrington, believing strongly that Baxter had what it took to play the part, what he called bitch virtuosity. And I simply think that we should bring that in. That should be, serving, that could, we could just make
absolutely
that bitch virtuosity kind of goes hard. And I think if the women want to do that, they should just claim that.
Feels like the women in our circles would be using that a lot.
I think that's mainly why I brought it up.
I think we need to get Liv Rylan on that immediately.
Can we? I think we should. To play Karen Richards, Mankiewicz chose Celeste Holm, another Oscar winner who had actually just left Fox, so Zanuck had to hire her back for the film, which is just really funny. Parker, Claudette Colbert was supposed to play Margot Channing.
Really? Yeah,
45-year-old Claudette Colbert, who people might know from It Happened One Night, and also the one where she's in a milk bath that one time. I don't know. I just remember, I was like, why is she in a milk bath? I don't know. She played an empress or something. So, and then she had a back injury 2 weeks before filming was to start. So Mankiewicz and Zanuck decided that Davis was their best option, but Zanuck and Davis had not been on speaking terms for 9 years.
Sure.
After Davis walked out of her role as president of the Academy. I don't know if you know this, Barker, but Bette Davis was an opinionated person who held a lot of grudges and made a lot of enemies.
Curious.
And we love her for it. Zanuck had to swallow his pride and call Davis at home, which he was like, "It's Daryl," and she was like, "Daryl who?" And he was like, "Daryl Zanuck," and she was like, "Don't joke with me. Who is this?" And he was like, "It's Daryl Zanuck." And she was thrilled by the script. She loved it. By 1950, 41-year-old Davis's career was in a hole, following a string of box office flops, and especially after a contentious termination of her contract with Warner Brothers. She and Jack Warner had been arguing for years, and she could, after 18 years there, she had terminated her contract. So she thought she was through, as did everyone else. So she knew that this role was important. She was like, "This could change everything for me."
Sure.
Her fellow stars and even Mankiewicz were anxious about working with her. Celeste Holm tells this story about how she and her male co-stars were on the plane, and she was like, "What do you think it's going to be like working with, the Queen Bee?" And one of the men is just like, "I think we'll all be a lot happier in 9 weeks." He's like, "When production's over, I think it'll be fine, but I don't know about in between." But Davis was like super agreeable on set. She made no notes in the margin of the script. She said that the script was perfect. She didn't need to make any changes, which is just so funny. The implication that every script before that, she was like, "I'll make some changes." And there were rumors that there was cattiness on set, but that was just by nature of anytime there were women starring together, everyone went, "Well, I'm sure everyone's very catty on set." But Celeste Holmes like, "You think we'd be unprofessional? Like, you think Mankiewicz would let us do that?" Yeah. She's like, "We wouldn't do that. He wouldn't let us do that." But she did say that Bette Davis basically didn't talk to her the entire production. She says that she walked on set, and again, this is Celeste Holmes' story. She walked on set and said, "Good morning" to Bette Davis, who responded with, "Oh, shit. Good manners." And then they never spoke again.
Sure.
Says Holm, "She called me a bitch." Okay. That was how she delivered it in the behind-the-scenes featurette. It was fantastic.
Amazing.
During production, Davis was in the midst of a bitter divorce from her third husband, and Davis and kind of romantic co-star, Gary Merrill, who played Bill Sampson, who is Margo Channing's partner, they had a bit of a flirtation, and they even got married after the production. Just hours after Merrill's own divorce was final, they later adopted a baby girl and named her Margo, which I think is kind of cute. And then they got divorced 10 years later.
Sure.
Said Bette Davis, "He married Margo Channing and I married Bill Sampson." And then they weren't really those people, which you hear a lot when people kind of get together on sets. The day after the premiere, Davis placed her handprints in cement at the Chinese Theater, which I just thought was really cool.
Very cool.
All About Eve was a massive hit and achieved a record number 14 nominations at the Academy Awards, tied with both Titanic and La La Land for highest number of nominations. So the 3 most nominated films of all time at the Oscars are All About Eve, Titanic, and La La Land. It was nominated for Best Supporting Actor for I actually didn't take note of who, but he won. Best Director, Mankiewicz won. Best Writing Screenplay, Mankiewicz won. Best Costume Design, Black and White, they won. Best Sound Recording, they won. Best Picture, they won. Anne Baxter, in a twist, requested that she be nominated for Best Actress alongside Bette Davis, which is fair, considering the movie's named after your character, but also that's the most Eve Harrington thing you could have pulled on Bette Davis. In February 1951, for the first time in history, 2 actresses in the same film were both nominated for the Best Lead Actress award. Except the award went to Judy Holliday for Born Yesterday, most likely because Baxter and Davis split the votes.
Sure. Baxter
later admitted she should have accepted Best Supporting Actress, to which Davis said, "Yes, she should have." Which is... What else would you expect?
What else could you expect from Betty?
So those 2 were nominated for Best Lead Actress. Celeste Holm was nominated for Best Actress in a Supporting Role, as was Thelma Ritter. Was also nominated for Best Supporting Actress, which I'm like, she did not have a huge amount of screen time, but she got that nomination. It was also nominated for Best Cinematography, Black and White, Best Art Direction, Set Decoration, Black and White, Best Film Editing, and Best Music. Which is just an incredible amount of nominations, and it still won 6. So that's not nothing.
Not at all.
And then one last little thing that I thought was interesting, Parker. This was one of the last films to be shot on nitrate camera stock at 20th Century Fox.
Ooh, okay, yeah.
In 1970, the Museum of Modern Art was kind of doing some preservation stuff, and they asked their president, who was about to retire, they were like, if there was any film that you'd want us to preserve specifically, because Fox was moving everything over, copying everything over to like safety film, but they were like, is there anything that you'd want us to preserve? And he said All About Eve. So in 1970,
nitrate sucks.
Yeah. So in 1970, MoMA made a fine-grain master positive from the original camera negative, and then in the late 90s, work began on restoring it in advance of its 50th anniversary for the first time.
Nice.
And then I don't have any information on the Criterion restoration because I didn't have the Criterion with me. But
sure.
There you go. That's kind of some background on production. Quick question, Parker. Is this a potential grab at the next Criterion sale?
It's up there. It's on my list.
Okay.
No, it's on my list.
On the list. Okay.
Yeah, it's not like an immediate buy, but it's
not like
one that's
man.
Yeah, but it's made my list. Like
it's no face in the crowd.
No.
It's no local hero.
Mm-hmm.
It's no. Couldn't think of another one. Should we go over the summary?
Yes, let's.
Let's do it. So we open at the Sarah Siddons Society.
Good name.
We're very good. It's a real thing.
Oh.
Sarah Siddons was a real early English actress. She's considered the first diva in English theater. So it's a real thing, and they really give this award out every year. They did not give it to Eve Harrington in 1951. She's not real. Sorry to tell you that.
Pour one out.
Pour one out for the characters who aren't real.
Yeah.
They don't know. Don't tell them. So Eve Harrington is being given the Sarah Siddons Award, their highest honor. Addison DeWitt starts doing some narration. And he's just kind of like, yes, well, theater, you know? That's kind of the vibe.
Yeah, pretty
theater.
much.
And then he goes, oh, and here's Margo Channing, and she's a star. There's Bill Sampson. And then he's just a famous theater critic and a man of notable influence. The cast, Margo Channing, a once star, now in her 40s, played by Betty Davis. Karen Richards, played by Celeste Holm, wife to Lloyd Richards, a famous playwright, played by Hugh Marlowe, which is a great name, by the way. Yeah. Hugh Marlowe's a fantastic
Hugh Marlowe's
name.
really good.
And Bill Sampson, famous theater director, Gone Hollywood, played by Gary Merrill, which is a worse name, in my opinion. It's too much, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Does that make any sense, what I just said?
Yeah.
Also, Max Fabian is there, played by Gregory Randolph, but he's not really a part of the core crew. Addison's just kind of like, and Max Fabian's here. He's a producer.
Yep.
I was like, is he a big part of this? No. He has some funny lines, and he's vaguely European. Mm-hmm. After Addison says the title of the movie, he wonders what else one could possibly want to know about Eve Harrington. That was just me laughing at my own summary. Mm-hmm. Karen takes the narration baton, and we flash back to Karen arriving at the theater after Margo and Lloyd's show is over, where she finds Eve Harrington waiting in the alleyway, something Eve's been doing a lot of lately. Karen brings Eve backstage to meet Margo, but Karen leaves her just outside Margo's dressing room to wait while she enters the room, which is really funny because then Karen's like, what about all those people that love you, that see the show every night? And Margo's like, they're autograph hounds. They're terrible and I hate them. And I'm like, I hope Eve can't hear you. like I feel like Karen's like, Shut up. They bring Eve into the room and Eve tells them a big old sob story about how her husband died.
Yeah.
And she lives here now and she loves theater. Parker, what do you think? So we talked about how the screenplay is pretty tight. Yeah. This is kind of our first big like characters bouncing off one another. I especially love when Bill Sampson gets there, and Margo and Bill's relationship I think is written in a really fun way.
Very much. So.
But what do you think of the screenplay overall? What do you think of kind of the characters here, the dialogue, the framing device?
I like it a lot. In order of like the things I like most to least, the dialogue is really great. Like the dialogue, like you said, is like everything I want out of a classic Hollywood film. Just that like that bitey, that zippy, like it's up there with Casablanca of just like people zinging off each other and making it like, because like sometimes that happens and it feels super forced, but like you get really talented actors and somehow it flows like Sorkin dialogue. Like it feels so naturalistic. But yeah, it is completely heightened, like when you actually read the lines out loud. Yeah. And I think they have a good cheat here of them all being theater people, right? They're allowed to be a little bit more flourishy in their dialogue, and it works really well. Yeah. So I like the dialogue a lot. The general structuring, I think, is pretty good. Like I like the pace at which we kind of reveal the intentions of what's going on with Eve. I'm not crazy about the framing device because I find the narration to be inconsistent.
I also think it is odd that he tosses it over to Karen, and Karen's the only other narrator we get.
Yeah,
like, it just feels a little like, wait, so Addison's talking to us, and then he's like, what else could we possibly want to know? And then Karen's like thinking to herself, here's something. And it's
Right.
like Addison could probably just take us into it. I don't know.
Like, yeah, that's kind of what I mean by inconsistent, is that like it establishes a pattern that I thought was going to pay off of jumping into everybody's heads, and it doesn't happen.
And
so I'm like,
do that.
why aren't we just staying with DeWitt then? You know?
It's
like,
weird to go to Karen Richards. Yeah.
So that threw me off a little bit. Like that, the
Totally.
framing device element of that wasn't my favorite, but like,
Sure.
you know, we don't revisit it a lot, which is good. And it's one of those things that, like, again, I'm not of the camp that like narration is lazy writing, because it isn't.
Sure.
It's just that inconsistency of why did we go from one character to the other seemingly for no reason. You know, that kind of throws me off a little bit.
Because eventually Karen leaves the room, and then we're not with her anymore.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, well, who is our,
Right.
you know, it's just kind of like the
this?
narration is getting us back there, and then we're kind of left as if it's just normal movie. It's not someone's particular perspective.
Totally.
Yeah, which I think is fair. I think that's a fair point.
But generally speaking, like I like the writing quite a bit, and the dialogue especially is just, like you said, just really fantastic.
Yeah, it's a fun watch.
Yeah.
We already shouted out Thelma Ritter, so I don't need to go over that here, but Birdie is great.
Mm-hmm.
And that night, Eve kind of begins worming her way into the social circle and becomes what I would say is probably just Margot's PA, but with extra stuff.
Yeah.
Just like extra ambition. Like, she kind of forces, she's like, hey, do you want a PA? And Margot's like, all right.
Yeah.
I do love the moment when Eve is like, oh, I'll take that dress.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, well, we have someone whose like job it is to do that. And she's like, no, I could just do it.
Yeah.
And then someone points out to Margot, she's like, well, actually, the costume
Thelma's
people
like, hey,
have-
union.
Birdie's like, hey, union. If someone else does this, then that's a big problem. And so Margot's like, actually, or like I can't remember. I think it's Margot who goes out. And she's like, actually,
Yeah.
And Eve's like playing with the dress in the mirror, pretending like she's wearing it, and she's like, hey, actually, you can't take that. And she's like,
Okay, so I have a question for you. When you watch this for the first time, when did you clue in that this is all an act? Like, when was the point where you're like, okay, she's playing these people?
I mean, I think it's probably my favorite scene in the movie, because I think the movie has a very distinct moment where it wants you to fully realize.
Sure.
Which is the phone call with Bill.
Yeah.
Which I adore, and has such like a strong thriller energy of like the way that like Margot pieces together while talking to Bill, because basically Eve places a call, like schedules a call to Bill for his birthday at midnight in California time, because he's out in California directing a movie.
Yeah.
And so Margot is woken up in the middle of the night by an operator who's like, your scheduled call to Bill Sampson. And she goes, what? Okay. And she talks to him. And then at the end of the conversation, she's like, Bill, it's your birthday. And he's like, yeah, I mean, why else would you call me? And then she's like,
yeah,
Eve. And he's like, Eve's been writing me letters. And she's like, what? And like, I just love that moment of realization. And I think for me, that's, I mean, honestly, even from the beginning, like Eve telling her story and being like, I was in San Francisco and I saw the thing, like that all feels so kind of perfect of a sad story.
So
but
constructed.
I think the first time I watched this, I was so in the mind of like, it's an old movie, you know, there's
Yeah.
probably like a story like that.
Yeah.
So I think the first time I watched it, I didn't really pick up on it until Margot did. But this time I was like, this feels like a thriller the entire time.
Totally.
This feels like very much like my dad kept being like, is Eve gonna kill them? or like kill Margot? But what about you? When did you kind of immediately or
close? But like, it was interesting because while she's telling her story, I had the thought that I was like, you know, it's interesting, like the differences in gender dynamics, because if this was a man telling the story, immediately it would come across as incel and creepy. That was my initial thought. And then I sat there for a second, I was like, what if it is still incel and creepy? And so I just held on to that thread, and then I was like, I was right.
Yes, and you were. A lot of people do call out Eve as being a queer icon, because she's very much clearly in love with Margot Channing. And you know what? Who wouldn't be?
Yeah.
40-year-old diva Betty Davis. I mean, come on.
You know,
she's killing it here.
She's not very nice.
That's true.
Which
but
is, we'll
but I
get
wouldn't
into that
know
later.
that as a member of the public. I wouldn't know.
Yeah, naturally. Yeah, we'll get into that later.
So yeah, Eve's getting a little involved. They have the call with Bill. Margo becomes suspicious, and everyone's like, "No, she's just a kid." And I love Margo being like, "She is not a kid. She's a grown woman."
Yeah, stop calling her a kid.
Stop calling her a kid. And yeah, it does drive me crazy when he keeps being like Junior. But Margo throws Bill a birthday party, which also might be the height of the movie.
It's a good scene.
I mean, the entire party sequence is just fantastic. Margo gets drunk and berates everybody. A milkshake is like, the really delivery is so good. Like, just laugh out loud, incredible. Of Bill asking Eve, "Well, what do you want to drink?" And she goes, "A milkshake." And it's so funny. Yeah. Marilyn Monroe's there, as we talked about. Addison has this big speech where he's like, and Parker, this is the subject of both of our Letterboxd reviews, which is Addison DeWitt being like, "Us theater people don't belong in human society. We're of a different breed." And I was like, yeah, we all know what theater kids are. We all know.
We get it.
Everyone in the world is aware.
Yeah, I don't need the sultry sounds of George Sanders going, "Well, the theater is a very distinguished group." Like, yeah, we know. We know. We all were there.
It is really funny to watch this movie and be like, "Oh, right, they're all theater kids."
They're all
theater kids.
Oh, no.
Unfortunately, everyone in a movie is a theater kid at heart, you know? Anyway, I had a note here that just said, "Parker, thoughts?"
Sure.
So,
hey, thoughts? Yeah, no, it's just like, I like the dynamics so much. Like, there's just, everybody is just sizzling and popping off of each other. Something that's interesting to me about this movie, and this scene sort of sets it up and it goes a different direction than I expected, was that, like, all of these people around Margo kind of just seem to tolerate her. Like, it's sort of this thing of, like, it's that friend that you're like, yeah, I know they're kind of an asshole, but, like, I've known them for a really long time. Like, you know, the people you make excuses for. And
sure.
I was anticipating that to come into the foray a little bit, and it almost gets there. Like, about halfway through, it gets to the pitch where, like, everybody is pissed at Margo because she's being impossible. And then the movie's like, actually, no, she was right to be an asshole the whole time because Eve is duplicitous.
But she also apologizes.
Right. And so,
which is, I think, one of my other favorite scenes in the movie. So we can talk about that.
We'll get to that.
That's coming up soon, but I think that's a fair point.
Yeah.
Also, yeah, I don't know, just like Max Fabian as a character is so funny to me. He's like, funny. Who's this guy?
Who's this guy who's just hanging around? It's
He's just like, oh,
and it feels
hey,
like I can't place it. He's got to be a caricature of somebody, right?
He's got to be.
He's got to be riffing on some producer of the time.
I do want to say that one of my favorite things about this is the line in Margo's dressing room at the start of the movie when Bill's talking about Daryl Zanuck, and she's like, "Oh, you talk about Daryl Zanuck? What are you, lovers?" And he's like, "We might as well be," or something like that. He's like, "Yeah, I don't know," but like, I love that, especially knowing that Bette Davis and Daryl Zanuck had like they had like a whole kind of feud.
It's also funny to me, anytime like a fictionalized Hollywood story around this time, or like, you know, anybody in the arts, whenever they reference real people at the time, I don't know. It always gives me a bit of a chuckle.
They reference an actor. I can't remember who the actor is.
They do. It's slipping my mind. But yeah, they toss around real names.
They do, which is fun.
Funny. Yeah,
it's just funny.
Nice. It's good set dressing.
Yeah, so Max Fabian. So at the party, Eve asks Karen if she could put in a good word with Lloyd about Eve being Margo's understudy. She's like, I'd really like to. I don't know. I mean, I'm just so grateful. And it's like,
and I already know it. Like, we didn't have to find anybody.
I mean, I already know everybody. I know.
Yeah.
All right. I see what you're doing. Meanwhile, Max Fabian wants somebody to read with Monroe's Claudia Caswell. A great name. Yeah. A wonderful character name they just threw off to the side, and I'm so glad that Marilyn Monroe played her because that made her stand out. Margo agrees to do it, but on the day to read with Caswell, she arrives late on what seems to be Margo's standard time, which is to say that she's late a lot, to put in a good word with Lloyd about Eve being Margo's understudy. Oh, sorry, I just read that.
Yeah,
she arrives and learns from Addison that Eve is her new understudy. There we go. And already read the part with Caswell because Margo was like 4 hours late.
Yeah.
And she's like, "Oh, I didn't have a watcher." It's funny. And boy, was it incredible, and everybody loved it. Everyone's just like, "Oh my God." Like, Lloyd is like, "Oh my God, she's reading the lines that Margo usually reads, and it's what I
It's brand new.
In my mind. It's brand new again. It's exactly what I wanted."
And like, it's so fun. Like, I love watching Addison be just the worst this entire. Like,
Yeah.
he just loves to stir the pot.
Really does, and it's very fun to watch.
Yeah, he loves the drama.
I mean, I'm a sucker for the dynamic of like stirring the pot to the person who is known to stir the pot.
Right.
Like, I love that he's like, let me just put this into motion and then leave. Yeah, so Margo storms in and we get kind of that big argument we were talking about earlier. I love every line between Lloyd and Margo.
It's so
we already
good.
kind of went
It's
over some of
so
those.
good.
It's just great. And I love the moment when they all realize that she heard from DeWitt because she's like acting really weird about everything.
Yeah.
And then they're like, and then I love when I think Bill turns to Lloyd and goes, DeWitt. I was like, yeah, he told her.
Yeah.
Yeah, just love it. And this is unfortunate because they all kind of get into a big fight. And then I think it's Bill who's like, well, this is unfortunate because, you know, the weekend. And Margo's like, what do you mean? And he's like, we're going on like a trip for the weekend with like,
we're stuck together.
yeah, with Karen and Lloyd. But Bill stays for the show or had to go back early for the show because he's the director of the show. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, he had to fly back out to California or something. He couldn't be there.
Something like that. Yeah, but then he's at the show. He's at the show that Eve performs at.
Right.
So I guess he didn't go to Hollywood.
Yeah. Something keeps him.
There's something in the middle here that I feel like I missed on both watches. And I'm curious if that's just me or if it's not as clear as it could be. But basically Karen, looking for payback on Margo because she's being the worst, empties the gas tank so that Margo misses the show. Yeah. And the car kind of comes to a halt, and Lloyd's like, well, I'm going to go, see you. No. He gets out of the car. And I do really like this moment for Margo. Like, I like this conversation of Margo literally says, like, Karen, I know that everyone hates me. Yeah. She's like, I know that lately I've been the worst about Eve and everything. Like, I'm really sorry. And Karen's like, oh, no, you're good. But Karen's clearly like, oh, man. Like, I ruined her night, and now she's being sad in front of me. But I really like this conversation. I can't remember specifics, but, like, I really enjoy it. Margo says, she says at one point, she's like, everyone seems to know me. I wish I did. Yeah. Which I really love that line. Like, I like this for her kind of like the character of Margo, but also just like Bette Davis kind of, who's in a very similar spot to Margo. Like, they're both kind of reaching this age where careers for women kind of end. Yeah. And I just find it really interesting to have Bette Davis saying, like, I don't know who I am. Like, what am I doing? Like, I just think that's a really interesting moment that I feel isn't normally afforded to characters like this. Yeah. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. What do you think about that scene? Because this is kind of what we were building towards in our conversation.
Totally. Yeah. I like this scene a lot. Like, I think it works really, really well. The thing that bugs me has nothing to do with this scene. It's like Karen's reactions after this scene. Like, the jump to being pissed at Eve feels a bit stretched on Karen's part. Because, like, when they're reading through the article later on, the quotes don't seem enough to, like, get Karen to be like, that bitch, Like, it seems like that seems like a bit of a stretch. But this scene specifically, I like, especially for Margo, of, like you said, like, going out of her way to humanize her a little bit more. Because that was, like, the first half of this, I was like, I mean, I don't really care if Eve screws over Margo, Like, it doesn't really matter. And so I do, like, I feel for her here in that regard. And I wish, like, I can't put it into words what I'm wanting it to do for the second half of this with Margo, but, like, there's something from this scene that I wish carried over into the rest of it of, like, I want to be livid at Eve by the end of this movie, and I'm not,
Sure. Even when she tries to take Bill away, Parker.
See,
when she tries to get Bill to commit adultery.
That scene's so funny to me because she's so bad at it. She's really clumsy, dude. It's clunky.
She's clumsy as hell.
It's really rough. And, like, I'd love his reaction to it, though. I'm just like, what?
Yeah. And doesn't he says, like, he's like, I make my decisions. Like, if I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. Not because someone else tells me to, something like that. I can't.
I go after things like I go after things I want because I want them, not because other people want me to want them or something like that. That's what it is.
I think that's exactly word.
It might be verbatim.
So great job, Parker.
Thanks.
Parker's doing a play right now. He's very in the mind of, like,
we're going to dialogue.
And I'm sure that, you're the Margot Channing of your show.
Oh, absolutely.
Knowing you.
Marvelous. Yes.
Marvelous, yes. Yeah, I think that we'll kind of talk about that. I do think that everyone kind of comes around to Margot's side very quickly.
Yeah.
Just based off of the newspaper thing.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of like... Okay, we'll talk about it in just a second.
Sure.
I just need to get impressed by Eve's performance, Addison goes to her dressing room after the show to talk to her and overhears her clumsy attempt to seduce Bill away from Margo. Also just nice to have a man who's like... I mean, he isn't not interested, but he's like, hey, you know what, actually? I only go after things I want if I want them. And I go, okay, so you're not denying that you would cheat on Margo.
Totally.
You're just saying that you wouldn't do it because Eve told you to.
Yeah.
Which is like, that's an interesting defense, Bill. And then Addison and Eve have a really interesting conversation, which feels like, I don't know, the climax of a thriller, where Addison is like, and tell me again where you saw Margo in San Francisco. Was it this theater? And she goes, yes, that theater.
Yeah.
He doesn't call her out. He never calls her out. No, he does later.
He does. He
says there's none. That theater doesn't exist in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's like, that doesn't, it's not real.
But he's like, and your husband? And then she literally is like, there's a long pause, and he goes, Eve, your husband? What was his? Huh? And then she's like,
oh,
I'm getting into
George.
the shower.
She's like, what's his last name?
Yeah, and then she goes,
and she doesn't answer.
I'm getting into the shower, so I won't be able to hear you.
Yeah, again,
like,
it's also very
Eve...
funny watching her try to use the tools that she has, like, as somebody outside looking in. She's like, this is how I understand stardom and femininity and sexuality. And she's like, if I come out in a towel and tell him I'm getting a shower, he won't ask me more questions.
Which makes me love the character of Eve a lot, because she is like a clumsy manipulator.
Yeah.
Like, she's not perfect at this. Like, Margot's been onto her from day one, but she is charming enough that, everyone else around her is like, no, we like her.
Right.
But I love that, like, when it comes to actually, like, trying to, like, throw people off her tail, like, off her trail, it's like, no.
Yeah, there are lots of people here smarter than you, honey.
Absolutely.
And I like Addison in that regard of, like, I like that you can tell the entire time that he holds all of the cards.
Yes, absolutely. We'll talk about where that goes.
Yeah.
But, yeah, the next day, Addison's review lauds Eve's performance the previous night, driving Margo up the wall. And everyone else also reads this. And initially, Lloyd is like, I don't see anything wrong with it. Eve's great. And Karen's like, Lloyd, literally wake TF up. She's like, Margo was right. Eve is terrible. And he goes, oh, yeah. And then they're all just at dinner together. Like, it just kind of hard cuts to, we're all at dinner and we're all fine now. And everyone's in accordance that Eve sucks.
Yeah, everybody's on the same page now.
This movie kind of just suddenly goes into what feels like a climax, and we know that it's not, but suddenly it's just like, well, that's the resolution.
Yeah.
Everyone's on Margo's side now.
And that gear shift is probably where, like, my 1 star comes from. Is that, like, I really like the first half, I really like the second half, and that handoff between the two, I went back and watched the scene again and, like, listened to the quotes, and I was like, they're really, like, they're not that, and, like, none of it feels direct from Eve. Like, if anything, they should just be really pissed at Addison, and I'm not sure if there's something I'm missing where they jump immediately and they're like, oh, like, Eve said all those awful things about you. It's like, what? Like, there's just something I'm missing there, I think.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I think that's fair, because I can't really remember that kind of handoff, like you said, being super clean either.
The dinner scene did make me laugh, because I was just like, oh, I've had many an Olive Garden rant with some friends where we're all just like, man, gah. I was like, hey, I've been there. I know that.
Hey. And of course, they are at the original Olive Garden.
They are, yes, the first.
Yeah, and of course, because when you're there, your family, Bill is like, oh, by the way, Margo and I are getting married. Sure. And they go, that's wonderful. And then they go, yeah, at the courthouse tomorrow. And they go, oh, Margo, you should. And she's like, nope, I just want to do it. Yep. I think that's a really nice moment for the character as well. Mm-hmm. And they're all just kind of sitting here, and then a note arrives for Karen during.
Yes.
Eve has summoned her to the powder room, which I'm like, what happened to all those powder rooms? Are they still out there? Do they still exist?
That's a good question.
What did we convert them into? If they aren't there, folks who use powder rooms, write in,
please,
to the email address we don't have.
Our non-existent PO box.
Our PO box is the comments on our YouTube videos, which Thank you to our commenters on YouTube.
Thank you.
But yeah, so Karen and Eve have a conversation that I think is really interesting. I think that this is written very well of Eve's sympathetic manipulation of like, I didn't want those quotes to go out. She's like, I wasn't trying to be mean to Margo, and kind of brings Karen around to her side. And then Eve immediately goes, I'm blackmailing you.
It's a
like,
crazy
what?
switch. I'm like,
I really like Ann Baxter's performance of it. That's like
really
why
good.
it works for me, is because Ann Baxter immediately switches to like this really cold, hard, like
she like lowers her head, like her
and then
brows
she's like,
come
and then
more
she's
in.
like, here's the deal, Karen.
Here's
and I'm
what's
like,
happening.
I'm like, yeah, it works for me. Like it might be a little jarring, but I think that's a version of like jarring that works. Like
Totally.
I think it lands. Karen's kind of like, what? Eve is trying to blackmail her by being like, yeah, if you don't tell Lloyd to give me Margo's part in the next play, which was written for Margo, she's like, I'm going to tell Margo that you empty the gas tank so that I would be on stage. And Karen's like, oh no. Karen returns to the table, and Margo's literally like, I don't want the role. And Karen's like, oh.
She
and
starts laughing. It's really good.
I love Celeste Holmes' laugh here. It's fantastic. It just feels so genuine.
It's a really good piece of acting.
Yeah, really good. It's kind of like a quick, like, kind of like coincidence resolution, but I think it's fine. I think it works because Margo's also like, I'm getting married.
Yeah.
I don't need that role. I'm old now. You know? She's like, I accept it. She kind of goes on a journey.
Yeah. Again, it's that weird gear shift. I'm like, how did you get here, Margo? Like, Anyway, continue.
She did a lot of self-reflection off screen, Parker.
I suppose.
You don't have to see everything a character does, Parker.
Yes, I do.
I just liked that. That was good. The lean in, great.
Yeah.
Soon Eve is on stage as the lead in Lloyd's play. Bill's directing. People are fighting backstage, but Eve's still kind of manipulating everybody. She also tries to. I just love that it feels so just kind of like, I'll go for Lloyd too. Which is like really interesting. She like pretends that she has her neighbor call Lloyd and pretend that that Eve is having some sort of medical emergency so that Lloyd will rush over. And then she's like, and now we're going to run away together. And then Addison, when she tells him this, Addison's like, no.
Just fully calls her bluff.
It's just like, no, he's not. But yeah, so Eve, okay, Parker, I wanted to check if you noticed the use of any rear projection.
Not really. I mean, it was all pretty seamless.
There's a shot where they do the establishing shot of the theater that Eve is performing at in like Connecticut or something.
Somewhere, yeah.
And then it cuts to DeWitt, like Addison and Eve walking along, and it's rear projection
it's
walking.
Clunky weird projection
is so funny to me. Like it just looks. It's so obvious. It looks really bad. They're like shuffling to pretend like they're like it's just it's fantastic.
They don't match the pace of the people behind them on the screen. Like I was so glad they turned because I'm like, that woman's going to run into you behind you. Like she it's funny.
Yeah, it's really good. Just love like they clearly just were like, oh, we can't do it. Can't do another set. We can't do another shot. They go back to her hotel room where Eve is like, here's my plan with Lloyd. And then Addison goes, that's not going to happen, Eve. And then he lays out his plan. Yeah. And this is where my half star comes in. Because I don't understand this ending.
No.
The one thing I don't like that Addison is just suddenly like, well, Eve, actually that's not going to happen. Because you're going to do what I tell you to do now. Because I'm in control of your career. You're mine forever. Mm-hmm. And she just kind of goes, no, and like
she just
cries,
flops.
And he's like, Eve, it makes sense. We deserve each other. We're both terrible. And I go, that's true.
True.
In fact, before he said that, my mom was like, these people deserve each other. And then he literally later is like, we deserve each other. My mom was like, oh,
well, yeah.
Oh, he know. At least he's aware.
Yeah, at least he knows.
That's an interesting point of like Addison and Eve being like, oh, like Addison recognizing we're both master manipulators. Mm-hmm. He's like, you're a bright star. I can, we yield as like a way of me moving up in the world too. Yeah. But there's like this vague romantic connotation, which feels weird. Like, because Addison to me has felt so removed from any of that. Like he kind of like, not that he's like gay, but he feels like he wouldn't be interested in that.
No.
So there's this weird, did you get that undertone at all, or am I crazy?
Yeah, no, I got it, and it didn't make much sense to me either, because
there's this weird, like, it kind of feels like at the end of, I don't know, it feels like at the end of like one of those plays where it's like, and now everyone's has to get married. We're having 5 weddings. Everyone has to get married.
You know what it reminded me of, actually, now that you mention it? It kind of, go with me. It reminds me a little bit of the weird romantic reversal in House on Haunted Hill, where it's like, oh, by the way, the doctor and me are dating. Like,
okay.
Like, it's just like, there's no, and I know that that's part of like their, whole facade or whatever, but there's just no chemistry there at all. And so it just feels like, this feels like the guy playing the doctor in that just feels like such a sexless being.
Yeah, he does.
That it feels
it's weird.
Odd. It's weird,
especially when like
up.
Vincent Price and her are like so sexually
right?
Like there's so much going on there that suddenly she's like, I'm actually in love with the doctor, and I go, why?
Totally. And so like it feels out of left field here. Of like, there's been nothing about Addison's reaction to her in any of this that would lead me to believe he's remotely interested in her romantically or sexually. But there's that weird undertone to this.
Because he doesn't even really say that as much, but there's this undertone of like sexual. He's like, I own you.
Yeah.
And if it was more of just like, your career is mine. We've done great work together so far, and we can go further only if you do exactly what I say. Like if it leans more into, I am a man with power.
Right.
And you're a young, ambitious woman. And therefore, I am going to wield this control over you of saying, we can do better, but you need to stop acting on your own. Like, you need to do what I say.
And that's the thing that doesn't track for me, is that usually in those kind of power dynamics, it's, I improve your career, you give me sexual favors, right?
Right.
And so when I look at this, I'm like, what are you getting out of this, Addison? Like, why do you want to stick with her and, like, make her into something? Like, it gives you a chance to write better reviews? Like, what are you getting out of this?
Like, I don't, and because again, if the idea is that he's getting some sort of sexual favor in return, that hasn't been set up at all.
No.
And it's not, like, they don't have a chemistry there, and he hasn't been playing the role as someone who's, like, a sexual predator.
Right.
He has not had that at all. He arrives with Marilyn Monroe, like Claudia Caswell.
And seems completely understood.
He seems completely just like, go and give these men a good time and your career will advance. He feels more like, like kind of, he feels
like an agent.
He feels like an agent. He's an agent.
But that's not what he does. He's a critic. Like, it's odd,
It's
like,
unclear to me if he's an agent or a critic. I can't tell if he's both or not, because he is a critic, but then I'm like, he's acting like he's an agent. So
like, maybe he gets some sort of kickback from this. I don't know. It's unclear.
It's unclear. Either way, it's unclear, and I don't buy it if it's like a sexual relationship.
And to be fair to the movie, like, it is, because I did find a good chuckle when it cuts to the conversation on the telephone with Lloyd, and him and his wife just have separate beds on opposite sides of the room.
Yeah, they're like facing each other.
Ah, yes. Hello, old Hollywood.
Yeah. Yes. And so like
maybe that's part of it.
It is a code movie, but I feel like I also just recently watched Facing the Crowd from 1957, which plays a lot more with, like, horniness and sexuality. And there are ways, like, so many movies conveyed. That's the entire reason that, like, that screwball comedies exist, is because they found ways to imply sexuality without showing it. Yeah. And so I feel like it's not out of the question to imply it here.
Well, especially because, like, her dynamic with Bill, like, even though it doesn't go that direction, again, you can tell he's interested. You can tell that he's like, yeah, no, I'd bang you,
Right. Like, there's, you're absolutely right.
Like, there's none of that with Addison. And I wonder if, like, to your point, maybe this just comes with the territory of the general, like, stereotype of theater people. Like, you could read him queer. Like, you could read him gay as the very, like, affluent, fashionable, like, theater man about town. But yeah, it's muddy,
Yeah. Yeah. So that's just, like, the one thing that really didn't land for me here.
Sure.
More so than, like, I mean, I think you're right talking about that gear shift in the middle. But I do think that, like, this part of the ending just really, and also then it's like the, him at the start being like, well, and I'm going to tell you all about Eve. Like, I don't get the vibe from him at all that he's like, and I own her. And this is also the story of how my career has taken off. It's just like,
he seems so passive in the beginning.
He seems so passive, and he seems so much like a journalist framing device, which happens a lot on this podcast. It feels like that. And then at the end, it's like, no, he's like a key player in the role of this by the end.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. It's just so.
Yeah, their dynamic
I don't
is
know.
strange to me, and it doesn't. And
Yeah.
like, I don't. Eve is so well written up to this point, and I don't like how
Yeah.
quickly she crumbles. I don't like that she's like,
This
it's not
ends
true.
with her like weeping on a bed.
Yeah,
Well, it doesn't end, and that's the thing
Right.
that saves it for me.
sure.
Is that we actually do return to the framing device, and then I think the ending of this is really interesting.
The ending is,
But-
I want to talk about the
And that's a
ending
more
of what-
powerful
yeah.
ending for Eve. But the fact that this has Eve at all weeping on a bed, because he also, I forgot to mention this, he unveils her true story to her,
Right.
which is that her name is, let me pull up the cast.
It's like Gertrude something, isn't it?
It's Gertrude. Hang on, where is it?
We're stalling for time.
So sorry, everybody. Gertrude Slozinski.
Ah, yes.
And yeah, he's like, I know your whole story, and I go, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But then the ending of that, kind of that note in their relationship really doesn't work for me.
Totally.
But of course, she accepts this and cries on the bed. And then we're back to the awards ceremony, and Eve gives a big speech thanking each of our main players, and I love the looks on their faces. I expect like Betty Davis is just crushing that kind of like disinterested glare, just kind of like complete disgust at Eve as she's like, I never thought I'd get here. Thank you all so much. And I'm like, to your point, Barker, that you're like, I don't see, I don't see why I would be like Eve is doing something awful to Margo, because Margo doesn't seem that great. But there is just something about Eve, how she's written and performed, that I'm like, we know these people. We know these people who like achieve great success in their field, and we watch them with like disdain because we're like,
Right.
you're so fake. Like, stop it,
Totally.
Yeah. So she is kind of, she's kind of achieved everything she wanted. Obviously, you get the incredible last line from Margo, where she says, "Nice speech, Eve, but I wouldn't worry too much about your heart. You can always put that award where your heart ought to be," which is just like eight.
Left no crumbs.
Completely leaves this movie on a high. The fact that is
Absolutely.
Margo's last line, right? Like
It
she
is,
just
yeah.
says that, and then she leaves, and it's just like fantastic. I will say that something that's really elegant here is the transition over to Eve as our main character, right in these last minutes. I think that kind of passover happens really naturally.
Yeah.
Like, I don't find myself being like, why are we ending with Margo? I'm like, no, Margo's done. Everyone else's stories here is done. Eve is the person that we're left with.
Yeah.
Which I do think is interesting, and I think really works for me.
So I want to talk about this ending note really quick. So
Yeah.
like, cause she goes home, and I'm sitting there trying to guess the ending.
Yeah.
And I, again, off the stuff we talked about of not knowing, I couldn't place Addison. And so I was sitting there, I was like, is his end game to have the greatest story ever told? Like, is he grooming her to be this success and then to be like, I thought he had somebody in the apartment who was going to kill her. And that was like, his
Sure.
end game is like, oh, this tragic star, like on the rise and then snuffed out too soon. And is it like she will be immortalized?
Which would be interesting in comparison with Margo being a star who
Totally.
ages out of her stardom.
Yeah.
I could see that.
Like there's an element of danger going
Again,
into this
there
that I was
is-
curious.
Like how there is a true ghost version of Vertigo, there is a thriller version of All About Eve that's fantastic
Totally.
as well.
But
the
ending that happens, I did not anticipate and is really good. And I'm like,
I think
that's good.
I
I
think
like
it's
this a lot.
wonderful. So Eve goes home. She, DeWitt's like, I'm going to the party. And she's like, I'm going home. I'm tired. She goes home, and waiting for her in her house is a young girl named Phoebe, waiting in her apartment. And she's like, what are you doing in here? And she's like, oh, well, the maid left the door open, and I came in just to look around. And then before I knew it, the lights were off, and then I was asleep, and I guess I'm here now.
Yeah.
She's like, I'm a big fan of yours, though.
I'm the president of my high school's fan club of you.
Yeah, which is like, this is interesting.
Hmm.
And then someone's at the door, and Eve immediately is like, Phoebe, can you go get that?
Yeah.
Phoebe's like, yeah, okay. She goes and she gets the door. It's Addison dropping off the Sarah Siddons Award. And he kind of looks Phoebe up and down, and he's like, who are you? And she's like, I'm Phoebe. And he's like, Phoebe, would you one day want an award like this? And she goes, yes. And he's like, I recommend you go talk to Miss Harrington about that. She knows all about how to get one. And Phoebe goes back in. She gives her the award. and then she kind of takes Eve's like, here, take my coat, go hang it up. Yeah. She takes it from her, and she still has the award. She goes in, and I do want to read this quote from someone on the behind the scenes feature.
Oh, yes.
Which is, yeah. So basically, his read on this was Margo to Eve to Phoebe. Each generation, the reproduction of stardom gets a little fuzzier. Of like, Margo was a true star. Mm-hmm. Eve is someone who emulated that and wormed her way into becoming a star based on her ambition. Phoebe is someone who idolizes Eve as like a replica of a star. Like, it's just gonna keep getting like a copier. Like, it's gonna run out of ink, and we're just gonna keep getting this. And this is Mankiewicz's best shot in the movie. Which is
such a good shot.
Incredible. And it's, again, it kind of reminds me of like the endless mirror scene, the brief shot in Citizen Kane. When Kane's walking, you just get this. I love an endless mirror shot. Mm-hmm. Phoebe goes into this mirror kind of place, like her in Eve's closet.
Her vanity. Yeah.
It's her vanity. And there's basically just visually, there's an endless maze of infinite Phoebes.
Well, what's really... go ahead. What's really cool about it is just like it starts and you see the facade. There's 3 mirrors.
Yes.
And it shows her, but the surroundings are still there. And then it either dissolves or cuts to kind of a liminal space where there is even more. Like, it's just infinite. Like, you can't see the room anymore.
There's just
and
infinite
I love that
mirrors.
Cut that happens.
Yes. And Phoebe, like, bowing to herself and turning and bowing
and
to
holding
herself.
The award.
And you just see this endless refraction of just Phoebe.
Yeah, dozens upon dozens.
It's
a great final shot.
It's a great final shot. And then this person points out that, this is an endless maze of infinite Phoebes, all imitating a true star, and Eve is the mother of them all. Mm-hmm. Which I thought was a good read on this of like, of course her character's name is Eve. That's very interesting.
That is good.
And so there you go. That's all about Eve. And that, talk about a last shot. That's great.
It's so good. And like, that's interesting, that quote, because I was thinking about that in context of like, just, the current landscape of celebrity that exists of, you and I have talked about before the death of the movie star and this idea of like celebrity as influencer and all of these things that are happening. And like, this especially reminds me, whenever somebody gets some form of viral success, everybody else tries to replicate it. Like in this instance, it's a crass metaphor, but follow me here. Like, Eve is the huck to a girl, and Phoebe is everybody trying to do that, and force it to happen.
Eve is the huck to a girl.
Yeah, because it's like, what do you do?
What do you do?
Yeah.
I 100% agree. I think it's really interesting to have like Margo as this star who's truly talented and kind of became of this in a natural sense, kind of our traditional movie star.
Right.
And then you have Eve being someone who looked up, kind of this 21st century, like, oh, I want to do that. But not because you want to be necessarily that talented. You want to be do that art form, but in the way of like, I want that success in a way. And I'm talented enough to get that success. And then you have the third layer of it, which is the Phoebes, which is someone who just loves, they are fans of Eve, but they're more of that aesthetic fan.
Right.
Of like, oh, and you became really successful and I'm such a fan. Like, I want to be you.
The fact that she's the president of a fan club is such an interesting like note to add in there, right?
Because especially knowing that Eve is someone who had a genuine love for, and again, not to say that fan clubs don't have a genuine love. So
sure.
Say your point.
Yeah. But no, just like the commodification of that, the fact that it's like,
that's
okay,
a great word for it.
Eve, for all of her faults, seems to have a genuine like obsession and drive towards stardom and Margo and all that she's achieved.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting that Phoebe is the stand-in for the multiplication of that, the group mindset of, okay, hive mind now, we all love this person for this reason. And like, there's almost, there's all sorts of interesting writings about like fandom and fan culture and like the Ouroboros nature of that, where it becomes, the culture is what is being celebrated and propped up, and like the thing itself kind of gets left behind a little bit.
Exactly, and that's kind of what I was trying to say. So I appreciate you kind of putting that in a better better words.
Sure, but I know I was following what you're talking about.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's just It's interesting.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Just for Parker and for anyone out there who's seen Andy Griffith and Facing the Crowd. Parker, I watched All About Eve on Sunday and on Facing the Crowd on Monday, and it's a very fun double feature.
That is a fun double feature.
As far as like celebrity and influence and being like a true star.
We got to get that on the calendar.
We
I want to talk about that movie.
We could look at putting it on this year if you want. We could swap something out.
We can take a look.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Any last thoughts on All About Eve?
I think that covers it for me.
Me too. I just think it's really solid. I think it's really great.
Really good movie.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so criteria, historical and technical relevance. Parker, I just read that book about Citizen Kane.
Yeah.
It's fresh in my mind what that movie accomplished, what it took for it to come out.
Yep.
How it was made, like every detail of that movie exists in my brain very fresh right now.
Yeah.
Also, unfortunately, I wish that I'd finished that book before we covered Citizen Kane properly, because I'm like, I would have liked to give a shout out to like everyone who did work on that properly instead
we're gonna
of going,
we're gonna come back to when we talk about Mank. Like we'll talk.
Yeah, there's a sneak peek at our Citizen Kane episode next year.
Mm-hmm.
It's not Citizen Kane. It's the movie about how Citizen Kane was written.
Yes.
The most interesting story in the world. It is kind of interesting.
Yeah. So with all that in mind for you, I can see that, and like having not known a lot about this movie, I don't know that I'm the best person to speak on this particular thing, but from an outsider's perspective looking in, the things that I find most influential and like historically relevant about this movie are the quote, fasten your seatbelt, it's going to be a bumpy night. And then like, it was interesting because this was my original review on Letterboxd, and then I thought about it for a long time. I was like, this isn't quite there yet, but this feels almost like the first draft of Good for Her cinema,
Sure. Yeah.
It's close, but like not, because we're not, for the most part, I don't think we're rooting for Eve by the end of this.
No.
And if we were, then it would be Good for Her cinema, right?
It would, yeah.
But like I think there is a level of influence this movie has in context of like the genre of manipulation thrillers, in the genre of like two strong female personalities clashing together.
That's what I want to highlight,
December,
especially. I want to highlight this brought Bette Davis back.
Yeah.
We wouldn't get, whatever happened in Baby Jane. We wouldn't get, Bette Davis's roles after this, which, maybe I can only list that one, but it brought her back. I also just want to say that like Joseph L. Mankiewicz is one of the great screenwriters of Golden Age of Hollywood. And that's not nothing. No. I think that this movie could potentially, that earns this movie some credit.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree. I think that the fact that this movie exists in 1950, and I would argue that it's two leads are two women. And then even like, we were kind of, talking about it negatively, but like the fact that Karen Richards, the fact that Celeste Holm is the one who takes us into the flashback.
Yeah.
I'm like, that works. Like, I do like the idea of like this being such a female-centric movie.
Totally.
And I think on the merit of being a 1950 screenplay, I think that this has really deep characters for women. And I think it portrays those relationships well. I mean, then we're getting into kind of the second item of criteria, but I definitely don't want to just flat out say that this doesn't have influence, because I think you're right. I think it absolutely has had influence. I like Daisies. We talked about Daisies earlier this year, Russian experimental film. I think this is another movie that I'd like to see have its 15 minutes on TikTok.
Yeah.
I think, let's just, let the girls identify with Margo or Eve, let them pearlify Eve, let them make her into a Good for Her.
Totally.
Do it, you know?
Yeah, I think it deserves a shout out. I think Kane gets the point, but I agree, and I'm glad you pointed out specifically that like it is, for the time period especially, it is laudable and needs to be noted. It's like, it is a very female centric script and
and
very
not
well written for those characters.
very well written for those characters, and not condescending to them, and not being like, well, you know how women are. It's like,
which is
no,
why I
Margo,
don't like that end scene where she,
Yes,
like
I agree.
that's bad female writing, I think.
Yeah, I think. But I would say that, like, yeah, I think like Margo's a real person. I think that Eve is a real person. They're real people who are motivated by real things. It's not just, oh, well, you know how women are divas. It's like they're motivated properly. Yeah. So yeah, I think it does go to Kane, but it's that famous asterisk we like to put on movies where we go, but also, but Parker, our unofficial fourth criteria, does this pass the Simpsons test? I doubt that it does.
I doubt it does. I would be surprised, honestly.
I'll
do a quick check,
maybe the bumpy night line.
Maybe.
But that's the thing about this movie, is there's not really like a thing you can easily visually parody that comes across to people,
Totally.
Like it's like the mirror scene, but like that's not like a super well-known shot in movies. It would be a real, Yeah. It'd be a real bet. It'd be a real gamble to try and parody this.
Oh, okay. 2008, All About Lisa. In a parody of All About Eve, Lisa stabs Krusty in the back, takes his job, and wins a prestigious award.
Hey, you know what?
There we go. We got it.
There we go. It does pass the Simpsons test.
That's so funny they do it with Krusty the Clown and Lisa. That's incredible.
That is incredible. You know what?
2008. Okay, there we go.
Good
Passes
job,
the
y'all.
Simpson test.
I hope that enters the
Which is
echelon
funny,
of, like,
considering I've never
Bechdel
watched a full episode of The Simpsons, but I bring it up a lot on this
I've seen the
podcast.
movie, and I've seen 1 or 2 episodes all the way through, probably.
Lots of clips.
I was gonna watch it on Disney Plus when it went on there, and then I found out that they cropped it incorrectly, and I went, "I'll wait until
You can
they
fix it.
And you can?
Yeah, you can fix it.
Oh, okay. Well, then
I'll show you the setting.
Oh, I thought you were just gonna be like pirates, arg,
Arg.
But I was like,
No.
Parker,
But
why would
also
you mention,
pirates, arg.
Why would you mention? What does that have to do with anything?
No, I couldn't tell you.
Second criteria, Parker. How well do you think it's doing what it's trying to do?
I think it's doing it pretty well. Genuinely, like I think, like I said earlier, the pace of watching the reveal of the manipulation works pretty well, even if I had already kind of clued in a little earlier than maybe the movie wanted me to.
Sure.
But I think it's paced very well. Is it doing what it's trying to do better than Kane is, though? That's a question.
Yeah.
What do you think? What?
Well, I'll bring that up in a second.
Okay.
That's a good question. I think they're really matched.
Yeah.
Because I have gripes with what both do
at
certain points, but overall, I would say both are doing what they're trying to do very well.
Sure.
Like, for the most part, I would say they're doing well. Oh man, that's tough, Parker. Why did we assign ourselves this impossible task?
I know. It's tough out here.
Hey, we should be really self-pitying about it.
We should be, I think. Can I throw myself in the bed and go, no?
Yes, you can.
Okay, perfect.
Parker, you must compare these films.
No.
I own you now.
No.
That's how I got Parker to do the podcast.
Yeah, that's true.
There was a weird sexual undertone that we still haven't placed. No, there wasn't.
We'll see.
I don't know, Parker. I think I like this. I might have to lean completely on the third criteria to answer the second one.
Okay.
I was gonna say you gave this 4 stars. You gave Citizen Kane 3.5.
Yes.
And I gave both of them. I gave this 4.5, and I gave Citizen Kane 4. So in the case of both of us, we both gave this 4.5 star or a half star more.
Yes.
Than we gave Citizen Kane. I don't know. Where do you land on the second criteria?
I think this connects with me a little bit more than Kane does. I like the characters in this more. I think they have,
which is I guess
some
third
energy
criteria.
Yeah, but I'm like you said, using the third criteria to answer the second criteria.
Yeah, totally.
I like. Again, it's the big hurdle I'm running into and have run into for a long time is that I feel unclear on what it is Kane wants to do. It's doing a lot of things very interesting and very well.
Yeah.
And I'm unsure which one I should be aiming at, whereas this is very clear what it's trying to do. And I think the only time it slips up is that final scene and the gear shift between part 1 and part 2.
Yeah.
And so for my purposes, I would probably give the point to All About Eve, the second criteria, just because I think the story of watching someone worm their way in and essentially replace someone is near flawless, except for those few stumbling points.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. I think this is a movie that makes what it's trying to do very clear.
Yeah, like I know how I'm supposed to feel about Eve by the end.
Yes, whereas in the modern era, I think there's a tendency for people to, as we've experienced, there's a tendency for people to not fully understand what the message of Citizen Kane is.
Right.
I read a book about it, so now I know.
Now you know.
But like, yeah, okay. I think that's a great way of looking at it. I'm with you.
Okay.
Parker, I'm with you. So that's
hurrah.
Does that mean it's 2 points to Eve?
I would give it 2 points because like out of the two, this was more entertaining for me. It's a story I find a little bit more engaging.
You'd put this on more regularly.
Yeah, I think so.
Kane, which I agree with.
Yeah,
it's fun. It's a fun watch.
Yeah. So criteria says better. Objectively,
taking a step back.
Take a step
objectively.
Back. Mm-hmm.
It's the direction that I'm considering the most.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that too.
Is this visually... But again, I don't want to knock the absolute success of the screenplay. However, Citizen Kane's screenplay is really good too.
It is. Genuinely, it is very good.
Genuinely, that's a really well-written movie that also has incredible makeup effects, incredible special effects in it, whereas Eve has a rear projection that looks
incredible.
Wonky. The editing is incredible. Like, that's the thing, is that every once in a while I go, it is Citizen Kane.
Right. Like, that's the reason the podcast exists. Is like as much as my personal taste on Kane is whatever, objectively, I can't take a step back and be like, yeah, people weren't lying for the past 80 years. You know,
it's not like it isn't like a pinnacle of filmmaking.
No, it is. It is really great. The whole point of the podcast is just, have there been things that have been made since then or before that
like,
are
also kind of
par,
pinnacle
you
of
know?
Yeah.
And so I think it's close. Like if I was putting them on the list, they would be like very near each other. But I think taking a step back, I would probably say Kane, just because it has a lot of the pluses that Eve has and a lot of them that Eve doesn't, especially in the editing and directing department. Because like another film that I was thinking about with this when talking about kind of what is missing here for me that sits at a 4-star is like something like 12 Angry Men also gets this theatricality and dialogue and characterization, and it's directed within an inch of its life. Like it is so well directed. And like I think he's doing a good job here with the direction, but that's not like the screenplay is the star of this movie. It's not the direction.
Which again is not a problem.
No.
Like I think that in watching this movie, the only reason it's a problem is because I'm comparing it to Citizen Kane.
Right.
This movie on its own I think is incredible. I like it more than Citizen Kane.
Totally.
But the fact is that as, you know, objective as we can be on this hyper subjective podcast,
right,
it's not see, then Parker, we have a real problem. We never should have started making that list. Because now I'm like, well, okay, if it's not better, then that means it's also not better than Barbie and Klaus and Lilo and Stitch. And I go, oh, but it should. But I go, no, we're only comparing it to Citizen Kane.
Yeah, it has to exist in this vacuum.
It has to exist in this vacuum.
And maybe when we hit like the 5-year anniversary, we will do an episode of revisiting the list and just shuffle everything.
Maybe we shuffle everything.
But for right now, it has to exist in a vacuum.
It has to exist in a vacuum, and therefore I don't think it is.
I don't think it is either, but it is like a spot below it. It's so close.
It's got that big old asterisk on it.
Yep.
Which is to say that I really like this movie, and I think that so much, like, I love what it's doing with female characters. I love what it's doing with its dialogue. I love what it's doing with that final shot. Like, I think it's a well-made movie, and I think it's really incredible. It's an incredible film. I understand why it's ranked so highly.
Yes.
And it even appears on the Letterboxd 250, which Citizen Kane does not. But Parker, you say it. You take it.
All About Eve is not better than Citizen Kane.
Which is kind of a surprise to me.
Which is also surprising to me.
But hey, that's what happens sometimes on this show. Everyone, thank you so much for listening or watching.
Yes.
Parker, it's my pick, but I want you to say what we're doing next time. What are we watching next time?
Max, next time, I'm gonna give you a warning in advance because things are gonna get violent. You know, in fact, one might even say there will be blood next time.
My goodness.
We're looking at 2007's There Will Be Blood.
This is a movie that I've wanted to do on this podcast since we started the podcast.
Yes, you've been talking about this for a long time.
Talking about this for a long time. We're returning to the Guyfall genre.
Guyfall!
Yeah, I'm excited. It's going to be good.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us for All About Eve this week. Next week, PTA's There Will Be Blood.
Yes.
Kind of. I think it's we'll talk about it more in the episode. I think it's a great transition from summer to October. I think it's a great, like, just normal summer to spooky time. I think it's...
And boy, do we have some spooky time plans for y'all.
We do.
I'm
we'll get
excited.
into that next time, I think.
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Goodbye.